Welcome back, everyone. I am excited to be here today with David Brown. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So now first, let me give you a little background on David. We know each other from the marketing and branding world, with David most recently serving as CMO at Honey Mamas, a Portland-based natural food company making absolutely delicious cocoa truffle bars. I highly recommend them. And David just did an amazing rebranding at the company, so I would highly recommend checking them out. And another thing that David and I have in common, besides our career function, is that we've both taken sabbaticals and traveled during that time. And, I'll admit that taking a sabbatical isn't something I usually admit openly, because while everyone wishes for sabbaticals, in my opinion, it's not widely accepted by corporate America. And, David and his now wife, Alexandra, wrote a book about their glorious year of travel called A Year Off, a story about traveling the world and how to make it happen for you. And A Year Off is one part memoir, one part travel essays, and one part travel guide. So I'm excited to talk with David today about his experiences and really dig into this a bit more together, as well as talk about general career satisfaction, as well as walking your own path versus, say, just keeping on the traditional kind of treadmill, if you will. So now the final preamble I'll give is that I know that during the pandemic, we're all not traveling. But I think there are good lessons that David can share regardless of how you travel, meaning even daydreaming or side jaunts that you can do now. And I think at this moment in this pandemic, we could all use a little dreaming about what a pause in the future might look like. And also, I would say the book has incredibly beautiful photography throughout it as well. So I encourage you to pick it up to carry you abroad now while we're hunkered down in place. So David, now turning it to you, can you share a high level of what you and your wife did, several years ago now? I think we were just figuring out, the adventure you took. And I'm curious, do you even call the time off you took a sabbatical?
Well, first off, thank you. It's great to be on the show. Thank you for that little preamble. And I don't think I do call it a sabbatical. I think I usually just call it, taking a year off. It was an interesting process to get there in the sense of, working really hard, moving through promotions and getting into more work that I thought was aligned with what I wanted to do and getting some satisfaction from that. But also just having another part of me that really missed, travel and seeing the world and just being in that environment that allows for spontaneity and newness and change and difference. And so for me, it was like, I guess it was kind of a bit of a first bet on the unknown of saying like, okay, let's just do this. I don't think I knew. Well, I originally wanted to take 3 months off and by myself, not with anyone else. I didn't even know Alexandra when I planned this, on a motorcycle through Europe, and then spend some time in Japan. And a lot of what I wanted to do was just look at products that inspired me and kind of ways of life that inspired me, and just kind of look at different makers and see where that would take me. And then eventually told Alexandra that this was my plan to take off, and she was wanting to go and said it kind of right off the bat. So we barely knew each other, and she's like, I want to go. So that was probably the biggest twist of that whole trip by a long shot, is that I really didn't know this woman. We started planning, and it went from just, hey, let's go for 3 months to, well, if you're going to straight up quit your job, why don't you take a year at least, and just, it doesn't really, the difference isn't going to be that big of a deal. And I was very anxious about re-entry and what this meant to, everything I had built to date, right? Like, what will this mean for future employment? What does it mean for my own drive? All that kind of stuff. But I think the reason that I was able to go was just like, it was the most sincere next step forward. It was the most genuine. If there was really something that was interesting to me, this seemed interesting, and we'll just see where it lands. And I think in the end, a lot of it was, well, I guess everything is always a little of that, like personal life and career. A lot of it wasn't in around personal life in the sense of like, I needed to live in a different way than I was living before. And I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I knew I wasn't feeling the satisfaction I wanted to feel from like hurdles that I was jumping. I was like, oh, that's supposed to feel better than that. And that just like wasn't really happening. So I was like, well, do something you want to do then. And so I was so incredibly nervous, but what we ended up doing was, okay, it's going to be a year. And we decided on a general plan, east to west. There's a little part in this book where we started getting a little bit more, we both do strategy, so a little more strategic about where we'd go. And it's still just a general reference that we use all the time, which is a balance of like tourism, weather and different elements basically to say, okay, when is the best time to be where? And we sort of chase the sun generally around the world. So it was kind of a year-long summer, which was really nice. And it was such a good decision. I loved it. And coming back was nothing like what I thought it would be like, and the trip was nothing like what I thought it would be like. So does that answer your question?
It does. And I'm going to probe a little bit more. I love what you said about, the sincerity. And I wonder, what should people be looking for? You mentioned like you weren't getting the satisfaction from the hurdles you were jumping, and that was a signal for you. If you were to advise people, even if it's just a pause, right? That they need to be looking at things a little bit differently, even if it's not taking a full year off to go travel, but what should they be paying attention to? Because I think so often we all just get on the treadmill and we forget to pay attention to how we're feeling. And then it's X number of years later where that lack of satisfaction starts to wear on you. So to me, right. I'm impressed that you were paying attention enough to recognize it and then to go fill yourself up by taking a year off of travel. So do you have any advice for people around what they should be paying attention to and what they should be looking out for?
That's a very loaded question. It's interesting. There's a lot of different inroads I could take on that. I mean, I think, I wasn't doing this then, but I wish someone would have mentioned it to me. I probably wouldn't have listened because I hate these kind of exercises, but it's such a great exercise. What I do now is I do brand strategy, And it was great because it enabled me to use kind of the left and right sides of my brain, which is just kind of, I have no choice but to do that, right? That's just kind of the way I'm wired. And the job kind of helped with that. And so, when you're really looking at a brand, it's like looking at a person, you're really kind of trying to understand what's real about what's going on with this person versus kind of the show or how they're expressing themselves right now. And it's a deep, nuanced kind of qualitative experience. And I think, I didn't really apply that to myself so much. And I think like I was noticing that for being as, like early on in life, very artsy, I was really kind of just knocking down the, hurdles that gave me, which I think most people are looking for. What are you doing that gives you value, right? Like as a human being, what makes you worthy of being on the earth or worthy of a good partner or worthy of a promotion or just a general sense of worth? And I think like, there are some paths that are like, well established and they usually link with like dollars that make people feel like, okay, I got kind of a general standard of worth right now, and as I was going through and did, a big brand relaunch, which was awesome. But after the intensity of it all kind of died down and I was feeling more confident in my skill set, I think that the temple bow, or whatever term you want to use to answer your question more directly, was just that I had a certain expectation, or once the buzz of things sort of wore off, I was able to align kind of what did you think you were going to feel like? Did you even take the time to think about what you thought you'd feel like? Or were you just kind of up on the buzz of success and whatever that felt like at the time and what that does for you? And I think what I was able to look at, momentarily, which I just think is the way that all this kind of stuff is. It's only momentary that you get a sense of oh, okay, I think I know what I'm doing. I think balance is this as a word makes you think of stability, but in reality, it's a constant alertness, constant focus, constant use of your muscles, and you really only notice balance until you're out of balance and you're swinging one way or the other, and there's actual big movements. And so I think for me, I'm in a constant state of this exact same process of just okay, if I've done, if I was to give advice, if you're doing something and the exercise that I would have done then is to do this values thing of okay, this is what I value across my life. That's what I did for brand. I was able to really get into the nitty gritties and then create strategies, goals, and objectives against what I thought was really a true center for this brand and how that relates to the world right now and what's most relevant. And do the exact same thing for yourself. What is it that you ultimately kind of value for the self right now? And how is it that you're actually going for whatever that looks like? And just kind of know that, there's just there's ups and downs of exhilaration, I guess, within your career and whatever things that others may deem as success. But that if you get that sense where it's I thought this is going to be something else, or this really does not feel like me, to pay attention earlier, pay attention kind of as quick as you can, and make those pivots when you're, more nimble. I don't know if that's a long way to answer your question. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it's super helpful, David. And you touch on so many things that I think are really important when it comes to sustainable ambition. I'll probably cover them off a little bit more. And so much around just really paying attention, listening to those little voices of something's off, the idea of, balance. I struggle with the word balance too. And I think it is, I kind of see it as more imagine you're on a tightrope. You are balancing, but you are constantly adjusting and paying attention. And, and then it's only like you said, in those key moments where you're oh, something is off and I need to change something. And I think this idea of also really paying attention to your values and aligning to those values. I talk about that around right success, one of the 3 pillars of sustainable ambition. And so there's so much good in what you just shared. And then I want to go back to as well, you just said when you were talking about your story, it didn't quite, the travel, it wasn't quite what you expected. And I think I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about what might have surprised you most, and what you learned or what you knew after it, on the other side of it, that you didn't know before you went into it.
Well, I think I learned a lot, so it's pretty hard to sort of say,
People need to go read the book is one. I
yeah.
do know. So if you want to kind of do some highlights or
Well, I think for me, I think one of the first things I realized was that change is, even if you're, what I considered myself to be somewhat young, but I'm not exactly 18, or I wasn't exactly 18 when I left, change is challenging. And right off the bat when I left, I learned a whole bunch of things about myself, that I had a lot of identity with work. I had a lot more fear of a lack of stability and like all these kind of things that I just didn't have when I was 18, the last time I traveled around, And so I think like, a huge part of the trip was, surprisingly interpersonal. And when you're traveling, you really want to be present. Like, you can continuously say, well, I didn't go all the way wherever I am to just not be here, And I think like it's harder to do that at home. It's like, well, you woke up especially during COVID, you woke up in the same place, there's lots of reasons to not be present. But when you're on a trip, you really want to be present, and you're faced with different things that enable you to be present, and you're faced with things that really kind of pull you away from that. And so a lot of that becomes kind of like, interpersonal. And I think one of the things, coming home was just how important it is to try to keep that presence, try to keep space for a sense of spontaneity, and how, how counterintuitive it can feel to do that, because we have lists and we have things that we have to get done. And very often the things that we have to get done feel, monumental. And I think it's really hard to be present to what's going on. And the little tricky part of it is that, like, very often if you are, the things that are going on or those problems that you need to solve are all running in the background. And I often think about it as like, if you're oriented from like an intention standpoint, you will just start to see things that matter, right? It's sort of like, oh, I got a maroon Subaru. I think everyone in Portland has a maroon Subaru, but like that's what we have. And I see them everywhere now. I'm like, oh, look, there's another one. Oh, there's another one. And it's just like, I'm not looking for a maroon Subaru, but I just happen to own one. And there's a lot here. Maybe that's one of the reasons. But any car you have, you just see your same car all over the place, right? And I think like it doesn't take any effort. And I think like that's one of the big things that I took away was just the value of being present. I mean, nothing on our trip great would have happened if we weren't really present to some level of spontaneity. I mean, planning is really important, right? And we did a ton of planning, and that the two aren't really a conflict. I don't want to like put them as like, oh, everything was just spontaneous and wild. But it's more that like as you're going through your plan, as you're doing what you're doing, that you're very much so awake to experience what you're doing. And so, bringing that in on the flip end, it was a big kind of like, oh yeah, that was awesome. It wasn't really what I thought the trip would be about, but that really was what it was about, was like the more and more present we were, just the better and better the trip was. And that was basically the key to having a good time. Was like, and I think it's kind of the same now. It's like sort of the key to a lot of different things is really being aware of what's going on and being connected to what you're doing.
Yeah,
I can go on. I can tell you more, but I think that's a good one.
Yeah, no, I think it's so wise. And, it really resonates with me because this was one of my biggest lessons from my time off too, which is, and I really wish I recognized it while I was on the trip, but it was kind of this fretting about things while I was on the trip and recognizing that it was impacting me negatively. And it's like, I wasn't going to solve it right then. And I was not fully embracing where I was. And it really struck me in reading the book. Alexandra notes in the book about how, 3 months before the end, she went ahead and started to consider work upon return. And she writes that it was her biggest single regret of the trip. So I can very much relate to this. And I just want to mention this because it relates to what you're talking about, that I've even experienced this on vacation, like a 7-day vacation where you're like, oh, I'll just check email quickly. And all it takes is one email that's kind of written in a snarky way, or you misinterpret, that can throw you off and like ruins 1 or more days of your vacation. And it's just so not worth it. So this idea of like staying present and protecting your time and your mental space, I think is really, really important. And I'm taking away that you are saying, not just when you're away, not just when you're traveling for a year, but essentially day to day. Like, are you present for your life?
Yeah. And I think that's been, and that will always just sort of be, it's not, I sometimes just get so frustrated with myself of like, I thought you learned that trick already. Didn't you figure that out? And I think like, no, I didn't. I will, but I did figure out that like, I got to figure it out today and I got to figure it out again tomorrow and like in the next 20 minutes. And I think like, that was a big kind of, piece to the whole thing is like, okay, continue to be present, and preserve that ability and take like a bet on that it's gonna work out well. And it's just, I just think it's so easy to not be, to just get kind of caught up in what's going on. And it's such an easy thing to say, be present, but it really makes you, no one wants to be present to things that aren't great. If you're not feeling great, you don't want to be present to that. Like you would like to move away from that feeling as quickly as possible. And I think like it's kind of counterintuitive. Like you touch a hot stove, it hurts, and you just like, you never ever do that again. But like with things that pull you away from being present, whether it's not being satisfied in your career or anything else that's going on, it requires you to sit with that and actually kind of look at it. And like, unlike the physical world where it's like, there's no time where you're required to put your hand back on a hot stove. I think with like emotional things and like the ability to be present and see what's going on and like does sometimes ask you to sit and be uncomfortable with what is going on and actually like return there versus running away and saying like, okay, well, let's look at this with like a lens of interest, to say like, I'm interested in why, and that's also super hard because normally, it's more than interest. It's like you're upset yourself or you're, enthused by yourself or whatever it may be. And I think like, the pursuit of being more present, whether it's on the trip or whether it's working through an email that you get on vacation, or whether it's just getting through, day-to-day kind of life, especially through COVID, it's interesting to allow the, fluctuation of what you're feeling and what you're processing to enable yourself to be as there as you can be. And I found it to be one of those, practices, I guess, that's really useful.
Yeah. And this is one of the things I really love about the book, David, is that you and Alexandra address the emotional side of things, as well as like the connection of those emotions around like the opinion of others as well. And I was wondering if you could say, so I mean, I really highly encourage people who are going to travel like this to pick up the book, because this was one of my lessons in taking time off too, is that one doesn't realize that you're going, just as you said, you are going through a change and you go through all the stages of change and transitions that are typical. And we don't always think about how do I prepare myself for that? How do I deal with what's in the middle? How do I deal with reentry? And you talked about identity impact. And I wanted to see if you could just say a little bit more about that and maybe on like how that related to reentry and coming back into both the, coming home as well as then like stepping back into work and career.
Yeah. I think one of the, like probably the biggest, lessons I had, I think Brian Ing, who, we both know, asked, I think we were getting whiskey, asked me like, so what did you learn on the trip or something like that? And I don't know what I said, if I said this exactly then or if I thought about it after we left. But like, I think I said it then. But basically there is like that there really isn't a sustainable option other than to be yourself. And I think like for me, generally I've been able to be pretty flexible. Like, okay, if you need me to do this, I'll be that way. And it's always like, I think I may be, who knows? I've never been in anyone else's skin, but I may be more flexible than the average person. Not really sure. But I know that it has brought up things where, like, especially like interpersonal, where I can come across very, very type A, and then I can come across like completely like an artist. Like, I can kind of like be like completely on either end. And, it's a blessing and a curse. So in some ways, I really can struggle with, being really like your, authentic self, or showing up as yourself. And it's an amorphous thing. Like, every day you change a little bit every day. It's not, you're not stagnant. You're a dynamic kind of person. And I think like, you know, with that whole process of like, I guess I could say, with coming back in and Brian asking, what did you learn? And saying that, there's really not a sustainable option other than to be yourself. I think that like, I put together a sense that I will need to, approach this daily, I guess I should say. Similar to the presence piece. That like, I'll need to kind of come back to this all the time and say like, okay, if I'm looking for another job, will I be myself, and kind of for how long? And so like, I just have found it to be sort of continuous. And I think like right now I have two young kids, and one of the biggest things that I've picked up from that is just that people are born different. And that like, they're just really, it's like there's a lot of things that happen in the world from a nature standpoint that I may have underestimated before, and that like we don't necessarily all fall into these like into these little spots, and we're needing to feed different pieces of ourselves at different times. And I think like for some that means one career, their whole entire existence, one thing that they just pursue and they do. And for other people, it doesn't mean that. And I don't think there's really a right or wrong. I mean, everyone always says, no right way to go. But like, I think that for a lot of people, that traditional path of career, and for me, that traditional path is probably never going to feel all that satisfying. And so like, it's just kind of an interesting piece. I don't know if that answers your question or not, dude. I feel like I wandered a bit on that one.
No, that's okay. I mean, what's coming up for me in hearing your answer is what I talk about with sustainable ambition. One of the other pillars is what I call right aspiration. And it's this idea of, I say it's about building a regenerative career. And it's partly because I believe that our satisfaction and our ambition ebbs and flows over time, and that it changes from decade to decade. And part of what I hear you describing is both that ebbing and flowing, and kind of how, looking at satisfaction at different times, that, we're dynamic people, and that, you need to pay attention to that over time. But I'm also hearing you say, because I think both of us at times in our careers maybe have taken untraditional paths. And it's like this challenge of trusting and leaning into who you are, as opposed to what you think you need to be. And I wonder if you have, that's partly where you were going with that, which is kind of, hey, the only sustainable option is to be yourself, and to kind of pay attention to who you are becoming. And, whether or not along the way, do you need to make adjustments to that? And the importance of like, perhaps, even if it's, hey, early on in your career, maybe you are fine putting yourself into a box because you need to check the boxes, right? But then there's going to kind of be like, hey, am I paying attention? And am I honoring who I am? Am I honoring my values? Am I leaning into who I am? So I don't know if you want to say anything more about that. Perhaps you already covered it just in what you shared earlier, but if that's, makes you think of anything else to add.
I can talk about that for sort of forever. I mean, I feel like it's just such an interesting challenge for some people, and it seems like not so much a challenge for everybody. And I find that to be, if you are in the world of like, especially if you have any element of the creative side, and that there is like this kind of more amorphous sort of life force that's giving you drive or not giving you drive, or wanting to create something, and it's that perpetual process of really showing up to place a bet on yourself. And when you think about it logically, it's like, well, who else are you going to place a bet on? You kind of have to place a bet on yourself. But I think that, as you said, you need to go through and you need to check boxes. You don't need to, but like younger in my career, I really very much so felt that I needed to. And I developed a skill set in and around doing exactly what I felt like I needed to do. And as I've gotten older, that skill set is at conflict with another skill set that I worked on, which was to, do the things that we talked about, to figure out how to be present and to figure out how to, be a bit more authentic in what you're up to. And I think that those two, elements of like, hey, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's like a steel town kind of place. There's like nose to the grindstone, like just do what you're supposed to do. And that there's some great elements of that. Like a lot of times that is what you decide to do. You choose to remove that choice, right? And like, just do this. But in the long term, when you're thinking of your next move, and I'm thinking about like optionality of how I want to go forward, as I know this about myself, that I like to be challenged and find new interests. It's like, how are you then listening to where you are right now? How are you engaging in the world in a way that feels like value to you? It feels valuable. It feels like you're doing something that is fulfilling. And I think for so many people, that remains the same job, doing almost kind of the same thing your whole life. I've always been fascinated by that, and really enjoy kind of talking to people that have enjoyed incremental differences through their career, doing very, very, very much so the same exact thing. And that sometimes on my end just seems like easier, but maybe it's not. I have no idea. I've never been that person. But, for me, it's very much so like, okay, what could this next thing look like? How is my mind engaged? And how am I feeling challenged? And how do I feel like I'm putting something of value out there in some way, improving things, making things somewhat better or however I define better. And like, it's been, I think that has been something that's just really interesting to follow, because as you said, who we're becoming, I guess you should say, and that it is this active process of what's going on. I think having kids or any other life change really puts a twist into that as well, where it's like, I literally have different desires now, which is such an interesting thing of just like, oh, okay, another life change. Like, you want different things, you see things differently. So yeah, it's interesting to try to hold on to that and take it seriously versus like, okay, I do not have this choice, and then the big distinction between choosing not to make a choice or actually just believing that you don't have a choice when you probably likely do.
Yeah. Yeah. So much value in what you just shared there. I mean, and I think what's one of the things, starting with your last point, in terms of the value of really acknowledging that, because I don't think we all think about this enough, which is that our satisfaction or our ambitions or what we're looking for at different stages of our life, they're different. It changes. And I think people get surprised. And I think through sustainable ambition, what I'm trying to do is also like take away a little bit of the surprise, like open people's eyes a little bit more to this awareness that this happens. And I think that's exactly what you were just talking about. And I also want to punctuate just two other things that you noted, which is that there's nothing wrong at all. And this is not what I mean by sustainable ambition either. There's nothing wrong with following a consistent path. Man, if you found that and it sings for you, like, God bless you. Like, I mean, that's wonderful. And like you said, some of us are wired that way and some of us aren't. And, even within that, I think there's still, new levels of satisfaction or new ways that you're looking at things, new ambitions. And I also think that, and I think you and I would both agree with this, which is we both feel a lot more confident and or that we have a lot more flexibility now, having checked some of those boxes early on in our career, and that there's a lot of power in that. And, going back to your book, one of the quotes that I liked as well as this note, and even though it was from, I believe, kind of the start of the book, where it's like, from our experience, there's no simple path to follow when it comes to mustering the courage needed to deviate from the norm of your norm. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's something really beautiful to acknowledge that, it's, it gets back to that stepping out and change, and that can be a challenging step, but a really powerful one at that. So again, it comes back to me to this importance of kind of just paying attention and being aware of what's going on for you. Yeah.
And, I very often feel like I do not have the courage to do that. That same question of before of like, okay, if this is like, I think it's probably because I'm somewhat flexible and I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is very much so. I'm sure it's very different now, but like, just do what you're supposed to do. And I always watch it not pay off. And, but it consistently, for me at least, like, has the illusion of paying some, at least break even of an investment of my time and focus, depending on how you look at it. But as I've looked at it and gotten older, I no longer believe that. I don't think it was a break even venture whenever I'm pushing against something I really don't want to do, because you're just fueling that skill set, or you're, getting yourself into a mindset that is likely detrimental to your general well-being, right? And your general well-being is really what's supporting you to be successful in your career, right? And so I think that there's this tension, and every time there's a change, like right now I'm being about a change, I'm faced with the exact same trepidation of like, oh, I don't think, I want to veer from what I do. And like, it's interesting, like, every time I've done it, it's when it's been so great. But every time I do it, it is also terrifying. Which is, it's just kind of like, maybe it's like jumping in a lake or something like that, where it's, you're always a little freaked out because it's going to be cold. And when you're in there, you're like, oh, it's the best. But it is an interesting thing that sometimes I wish wasn't the case, but I definitely feel like it takes sort of courage, to move from the norm that's become your norm, type of decision. And I wish that I could stand here and say like, oh, it's easier and easier. It's like intermittent fasting. Everyone told me that it's supposed to be so easy after 3 months. That is not true. I'm a year and a half in. Turns out that I'm hungry every single morning. I want to eat. It's just, I think it's the same thing whenever you're like, okay, let's make this other change. It's a little bit scary. But I do think that like the more and more I get older, the more and more the anxiety, I guess, is dramatically less. Mm-hmm. But it is still very scary, but it's not the deep fear of like, okay, I'm going to do something that's off the beaten path that definitely feels most genuine. And that's the other thing I always struggle with is like, can it be like all the way to gold? Like instead of most genuine, most authentic, can't it just be absolutely genuine, 100% authentic? And like, I just don't think that often happens either, where it's like the light bulb goes off and, the cloud part and this thing, appears where it's like, this is what I'm going to do, come hell or high water. I think it's very often incremental steps of what is most genuine, what is most aligned, What is the best next decision to get to this thing that I value? I think that can also make it more scary because it's not like this guarantee. It's these incremental steps that are moving you towards something that that you feel that you value and that you hope that you value later on. Kind of an interesting kind of challenge, and I do think it becomes easier. I always wish it just was easier.
Yeah, I know. Well, and I think this is really important for people because I think that frankly, we all expect so much from our lives, many of us, and as well as from our careers and from companies and our jobs. And I think that taking this pressure off of it needs to be absolute. And it's kind of what's it's the most, or it's the best, or it's the next, it's still making incremental improvement, I think is really, really important, actually. And so I appreciate that you emphasize that. I'm just going to start to, as we wrap up here, I wanted to ask, you talk about it at the end of the book, and both you and Alexandra write to this, and I don't know if this was purposeful, but you write, the adventure is not coming to an end. It's just one adventure after the next. And then Alexandra wrote, we equally didn't know what this next phase would bring. Maybe in a way we were still traveling after all. So I wanted to ask you, what's your next adventure and what's the next chapter of the book?
Well, I don't know if you're publishing swearing or not on here, but we had the joke of this was called A Year Off, and then after that we wanted to write the book A Year Full Fucking On. Because it was so intense. Like, we came back, we both started these crazy, careers. We got a book deal, we got pregnant, we decided to get married. It was just like, it's just this unbelievable, wild adventure of like, what is next? And I think, since then, I hope to not have another time so wild, after that. And it was a really, it was an interesting time. And that other year may actually spur on another book, actually, which is kind of funny. But, I think for me, holding that line of like, the next travel or the next adventure, what I enjoy about that, and still feel is that, there's this, for me, way I sometimes see discipline or whatever you're up to, whether it's like a serious thing or travel, not a serious thing, that these little categories that like, I'll sometimes forget to keep a little bit of humor in certain things and feel free to add humor in other things. And I think just looking at life with that general perspective of like, not so precious, right? That we're just kind of going from one thing to our next thing. And like, why not look at it as your next adventure? Why not look at it with a little bit of like a lighter or softer edge to what's going on? And like, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a challenging time, doesn't mean that it doesn't require an incredible amount of discipline, but that it like isn't so precious. It isn't so linear to something. You don't get anything in the end, right? We're all kind of passing on at some point. There's a lot about the journey that's, quite important. There's a lot about today that's quite important, and tomorrow. And like, taking that perspective of like, okay, like, here we go on the adventure of everyday life, I think is something I strive towards. I don't think it's something I like own, but it's really something that like I do agree with. And I think, right now, as I ask the exact same question, a lot of what I've been interested in, since pre-writing the book, and I actually dropped out of school to write a book on a similar topic to this, and I've used it throughout my career, but like incorporating what may, I studied anthropology, and then looking at potentially bringing in more psychology to look at brands, which has been kind of what I've done for a long time, but also just look at organizations and how we work. and also look at individuals and how we all work. It's just kind of seen, like we said before, seeing value there for a reason or another, and really kind of putting that into my own personal values. I'm sure I'll eventually make money in the whole deal as well, but like more than anything, is trying to look at other value, non-monetary value, and saying like, how does this sort of feel? And right now, how would it look? And then how could it look iterations later? And how is it kind of my next best bet on optionality that enables me to be an authentic me based on who I think I'm becoming? You know, and just say like, okay, you know, I think that, you know, this is just a very interesting path. And so, you know, there's realities. I'm not independently wealthy. And so, you know, I'm continuing to work on in the interim and still having quite the, engagement there to have that also be continuing in the same general path of, a bit more authentic about, okay, yeah, this is what I want to be up to. And then adding this other piece. And I have no idea how one approaches it. You know, it could be anything from probably not a very quick PhD, but like a very, you know, slow process towards PhD, or it could have nothing to do with schooling, you know. So it's just another one of those open kind of paths. And we'll see, you know, in the next probably month or two as I kind of cement this plan where it actually goes.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we were talking earlier before we got it started, just what you're describing there is you're planting the seeds for that next path and the adding on to everything that you've already done and set out for yourself. But you're recognizing, hey, I want something more here, honoring who I am and how am I starting to lay the path for what's next, which I think is great. So, by the way, I think you should write that second book. I actually think it's a really important chapter in terms of like how people really re-enter. So, I encourage you to do that if you can fit it in amongst like raising two young ones and doing everything else you do. But David, this has been such a fabulous conversation. I've learned a ton, and I think what's wonderful about it is yes, if somebody wants to take a year off, great. But what you have shared are these really life lessons that people can be bringing into their day-to-day that I think are just so powerful. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share this with everyone and share it with me and with my listeners. And where can people find you to keep in touch?
I think probably LinkedIn is probably the best way to go.
Okay.
You can message me on there. I try to stay activist. And thank you so much for having me. It was really great to chat, and I really enjoyed your questions. And thank you for reading the book.
Of course.
Glad that you enjoyed it.
Yes.
It was lovely.
I'm going to go spend some more time with the pictures actually, and with the what's noted in the pack, and looking and comparing to see like what pictures match to what location and what have you. So it's I personally can use a little travel wanderlust right now. So I'm going to spend even more time with it now over the coming months. So thank you again, David. This has been great.
Thanks, Kathy. See you.
Find more inspiring interviews and get show notes for this episode at sustainableambition.com/podcast. Make sure you don't miss an episode or my insider tips, guides, and tools by signing up for Sustainable Ambition Forum, my twice monthly newsletter. Sign up at sustainableambition.com/subscribe. Thanks again for joining me. Speak with you next time.